Chapter 9, Work Motivation. And for Chapter 9 and the rest of this course, actually, we'll be moving to the more organizational side of IO psychology. So far, we've been discussing more of the industrial side, and now we're going to move on to the organizational side, which is a little more closely tied to psychology, in my opinion. So today we're going to talk about work motivation. Work motivation is defined as a set of energetic forces that originate both within as well as beyond an individual to initiate work-related behavior and to determine its form, direction, intensity, and duration. Basically, work motivation is very important. It's what pushes us to do our work and do it well, do it long enough and do it continuously. And as you can see, performance, which is in the middle of the diagram, is affected not only by motivation, but also by the person's ability and their environment. But for today, we're going to be discussing motivation. There are two types of motivation: intrinsic motivation, which comes from within the individual, and extrinsic motivation, which comes from outside the individual. Intrinsic motivation includes things like feeling satisfied or proud of yourself, feeling like you're making a difference with your work, whereas extrinsic motivation is more like rewards and pay and recognition from others, that sort of thing. Okay, we're going to actually talk about three different types of theories of motivation today. I'm going to explain all the different theories of motivation, and they're divided up into three categories. The first one is needs-based, and then we'll talk about process-based and then application-based. But the first few are needs-based theories of motivation, which basically tell us that the root of motivation is to satisfy our own needs. Now let's look at Maslow's theory of needs. His is a hierarchy of needs. And Maslow's theory pyramid starts at the bottom with the biological and physiological needs in that pink part. For now, ignore the right-hand side that talks about our next theory. On the left side, they explain each of the levels in the hierarchy of needs. Biological and physiological needs involve food, sleep, water, even things as simple as air. Moving up a level to the orange is safety. Once we meet those bottom needs, we can then focus on the orange needs, which involve security, health, and finances. All of those need to be met in order to continue to move up the pyramid to the yellow level of love and belonging, which involves friendship and intimacy and connections, and then esteem, which is respect from others, status, recognition, that sort of thing. And once all those are met, we can move all the way up to self-actualization, meeting your full potential in life. And of course, this is different for every person. Now, Maslow's hierarchy of needs makes a lot of sense. It makes common sense, and a lot of people remember it from their initial psychology classes. But there's actually not a lot of research supporting that this is how it works, that people work their way up that pyramid in terms of motivation. Another theory, which also doesn't have a ton of research supporting it, is Alderfer's theory, which is called ERG theory. He sort of worked with Maslow's idea and divided them up into broader categories. So you'll see on the right-hand side, I added the categories for ERG theory. At the bottom, safety and biological and physiological needs are counted as existence. The yellow and green level are counted as relatedness because those both involve relations with other people. And then the self-actualization is actually considered growth. So it's not so much an end point as it is the where you want to be at. And these things also don't necessarily happen in terms of an order. They happen as like a constellation of all three. They don't need to happen in order the way that the hierarchy does. Moving on to more needs-based theories, our next one is Hertzberg's two-factor principles. This one's kind of interesting. This is often also called the motivator hygiene principle or motivator hygiene theory. And Hertzberg basically found that motivator factors, having them there, increase your job satisfaction, or increase your motivation and your satisfaction. such as achievement, recognition, responsibility, enjoying the actual work, moving ahead in the company, personal growth. All of those things are considered motivator factors, and those result in job satisfaction when they're present. However, on the other side, the orange side, we talk about hygiene factors. Now, that's not just hygiene like working conditions and emptying the trash can and having a clean, germ-free space, although that is part of it. It also includes healthy relationships with coworkers, good policies at work, even your supervisors, and then of course your wages and your salaries actually count in here as well, what you get paid. And what Hertzberg found is that the orange stuff, the hygiene factors, having it doesn't make you satisfied, but not having it makes you dissatisfied. That might sound a little bit confusing. Let me say it again. Having them doesn't necessarily make you satisfied, but not having them makes you dissatisfied. So think about that. You don't go into work every day and say, wow, am I happy that the floor is not covered in mud. This job is just so great with this clean floor. I feel so motivated to get all my work done because the floor is clean. You probably don't even notice that the floor is clean. However, if you came to work and the floor was covered in mud and bugs and rubbish all over, you might not be motivated. You might not be satisfied with your job. And if you continue to come in every day to a dirtier and dirtier floor, you might say, these working conditions are not good. I don't like my job and I'm not motivated to do my work. So having them there, we're not really thankful for them. But then when they go away is when we start to become dissatisfied with our job. I hope that part makes sense. Again, this theory also doesn't have a ton of research supporting that this is exactly how it works, but it is an interesting theory. I'm going to talk about one more needs-based theory that doesn't have a lot of support, and then I'll tell you about my favorite needs-based theory that actually does have a lot of data behind it. So this is one more. This is called self-determination theory, and this one basically differentiates between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, but rather than just listing them as two separate categories, it's considered more of a continuum. So if we start in the red column with external regulation, this is an extrinsic factor, and it involves things like compliance, rewards, and punishments. These come from outside, right? Your boss will fire you if you don't do your job. You might get a pay raise if you do your job. These are external factors, not caused by you. Moving over to the orange column is introjected regulation. Still pretty extrinsic, pretty external, but it's moving up the spectrum. This involves things like ego involvement, approval from others. It's still outside factors, but it makes you feel good inside. Moving over to yellow, identified regulation. This is in the middle of our spectrum. This is valuing your activity, endorsing your goals. If you think that your job has a good purpose and it's valuable, it's important, or your goals are important, you're going to be more motivated. And the reason that this is in the middle of the spectrum is that a lot of these activities and goals are outside of yourself. It's not that you're satisfying your own needs, but you do think that it's a valuable activity. That's your own personal judgment. Moving up to integrated regulation, this is considered an intrinsic or internal factor. This includes things like congruence and synthesis with self. So if your job and its values and its core matches with who you are, that's called integrated regulation. So not only do you value the activity, but those values match with your core values. And finally, the green intrinsic regulation, which actually has the word intrinsic in its name, is completely internal and intrinsic and involves your own interests, enjoyments, satisfaction, basically your preferences, your own opinions, totally from the inside. So as you can see, as we move from red up to green, it goes from completely external to completely internal. Self-determination theory, although it doesn't have a ton of research supporting it, does have some research supporting it. Underneath the chart, I gave a couple examples from Grant's work in 2008. Firefighters who reported high intrinsic motivation were more likely to work overtime, and call center workers raised more money when they had high intrinsic motivation. So this was two examples of workers where they gave them a survey or an interview and they found out whether they were more extrinsically or intrinsically motivated, and found that workers with intrinsic motivation were basically better workers. They worked harder, more productively. All right, on to the last, needs-based theory, which is my favorite one, mostly because it has a lot of scientific support behind it. This one's called the acquired needs theory. I'll read you the definition. The acquired needs theory states that human motivation is determined by the needs of that person, and that each person has a different constellation of these three needs. So it's saying that it's not in a certain order, that these three needs are all important, but everybody has a dominant one. Almost like the personality tests, right? We all have a little bit of everything, but we could have a high score, something that dominates. And the three different needs are need for achievement, which is related to wanting to excel or succeed. Need for power, which refers to wanting to influence others and make an impact. Need for affiliation, which refers to wanting to have friendships, feel accepted, engage with others. There's actually a lot of online quizzes and stuff if you're interested in what your dominant need is. You can go online and Google acquired needs theory quiz or acquired needs theory test and take one of those quizzes to see what's your dominant need. And the theory basically says that we're going to act differently and be motivated differently depending on our need. We're motivated by those needs, but not like Maslow's needs, saying we need food and air and security. It's needs for achievement, power, or affiliation. And at the bottom, I talked about the thematic apperception test, the TAT. This is actually a sort of like a diagnostic test where they elicit and assess your reactions to images. They show you a picture and they tell you that you need to tell a story about what's going on in the picture. And depending on what type of story you tell, a trained psychologist can assess whether your dominant need is for achievement, power, or affiliation. You can also do those online, although I don't think they're that accurate when they're not being assessed by an expert. I believe that is our last, needs-based theory, and we're going to move on to process-based theories of motivation. These ones are sort of like the next step up. The needs-based theories are a lot older theories, and they're good, but the process-based theories are more hands-on. There's more data behind them. Let's talk first about equity theory. Equity theory is the comparison that individuals make to determine if what they're receiving is fair compared to what they're giving. So in fact, there's actually two things we're comparing to. I'm comparing my output, my input, what I'm putting into this job, my effort, my hard work, my physical effort and mental effort, all of that input. I'm comparing it to my outcome, what I get from it. But I'm also comparing it to the input-outcome ratio of my coworkers. So for example, I might feel like I'm putting in a lot of work for not very much pay. But if everybody else around me is also putting in a lot of work for not very much pay, I might still feel motivated at my job. But if I'm putting in a lot of work for not very much pay, and Joe, who's sitting next to me, is also putting in a lot of work and getting paid more, or Mark, who's sitting next to me, is putting in hardly any effort and getting the same pay as me, either way that sort of tips the scales, right? My coworker either has to put in less effort than me for the same outcome, or puts in the same effort and gets a better outcome, and that's not fair. So equity theory is about not only comparing your own input and outcome, but comparing it to the input-outcome ratio of your coworkers or the people around you. So on the definition side, it says that the inputs are things the person brings to and contributes. So not only their effort, but their education, their experience, all of that. And then the outcomes are what they get, right? Recognition, pay, promotions, maybe a better office. And a key component to this theory, like I just mentioned, is that it's the ratio that matters the most. So somebody won't necessarily be motivated by good outcomes if they feel like their input is too high. There are three different types of people. So there are equity sensitive people. Those are people sort of like we've been talking about on this slide this whole time, people who want it to be fair. They think that their ratio should be about equal to everybody else's ratio. However, there's also something called entitled's. Entitled people think that they should get more in outcome than they input, or they should get a higher ratio than their coworkers. They think they kind of deserve more than everybody else or more outcome for their input. The opposite of an entitled is a benevolent. Benevolents are those who feel comfortable giving more than they receive, or they feel comfortable if their coworkers actually have it a little better than they do. So that's equity theory. Let's talk about organizational justice theory, which is another process-based theory. Justice is how fair an employee believes the employer is to all of its employees, not just them, but to everybody. This is very closely related to the last one, equity, that we were talking about. And in fact, the middle one, the green one, distributive justice, is pretty much the same as equity theory. I'll start with that one. Distributive justice are the perceptions of fairness regarding the actual outcomes of a decision or action. This is outcome focused, and that's why it's similar to equity theory. What do you get out of it? Is it fair? Am I getting a fair amount out of this job for how much I'm putting into it? Back over to the red one, procedural justice is perceptions of the fairness of the policies and guidelines used to make decisions in the organization. So this is not about outcomes, this is about what the rules are, what's set up, is it fair? And finally, interpersonal justice is the perception of fairness related to the way in which one is treated by others. This is more of a social thing. And justice perception is highly related to motivation because it's been found to affect task performance, helping behaviors, and counterproductive work behavior. If you don't think things are fair, you're more likely to engage in counterproductive work behavior. Our next process-based theory is called expectancy theory, also called VIE theory because it involves valence, instrumentality, and expectancy. It was originally developed by Victor Vroom in 1964. And expectancy theory, basically, we actually talked about it in the last chapter. It says that you need to expect that your effort, if you try hard, will be worth it, will pay off, that you'll be able to perform, that your effort will result in a performance. That's the expectancy. And then we're expecting that the performance is going to result in a reward. That's where we get to the instrumentality. Will my performance actually turn into something? Will it be worth it for me? So it's a two-step process. Expectancy theory involves the expectancy that my effort will result in good performance and the expectancy that my performance will result in rewards. Instrumentality is that expectancy that the performance actually turns into a real hands-on reward. And then the valence is the amount of how much you value, the amount of value you put in that reward. Is it something that's really worth it for you? Am I putting in a ton of effort to do a really great job and get a $5 bonus? Or am I putting in a ton of effort to do a great job and get a $5,000 bonus? Right? Those numbers could have different valence to different people. And process-based theories of motivation, which are all the ones we just talked about, focus on the mental processes of the employees to understand their motivation. And this can help managers to identify what they need to do to help their employees be motivated. It's more useful than those needs-based theories because we're actually trying to understand the mental processes behind the motivation. All right, working our way through this chapter nice and quick. We're on to application-based theories of motivation, our last category. We have quite a few in here, though. The first one is goal-setting theory. Goal commitment is the determination of an individual to reach his or her goal, and the higher your goal commitment, the more motivated you'll be, right? The more committed you are to your goal, the more motivation you'll have. Studies on goal setting and goal commitment have shown that the highest performance results from both high goal commitment and high difficulty goals. People are more motivated to reach goals that are difficult. Also, giving feedback about goal progress and removing obstacles to achieving the goals are important things that managers can do to help employees stay motivated. We talked in the last chapter about setting SMART goals, and it's even more important in this chapter. Employees can set goals for themselves, or managers can set goals for their employees, but goals must be SMART. They must be specific, measurable, attainable or action-oriented, realistic, and timed. These are the important things for a goal to be. Usually the A is actually attainable, not action-oriented, but either way, it means it's something that you can do, something you can actually get done. And same with realistic. Is it something that's doable, right? So always set SMART goals. All right, my favorite guy, Albert Bandura. We talked about him in the social modeling stuff. So I figured since we were talking about him again, I'd throw a picture up there. You can see what he looks like. Albert Bandura is 93 years old. He is a Canadian psychologist, not unlike myself, but he is a lot older than me. He's 93 years old, still going strong, and he is the father of a lot of important psychology principles, including the theory of self-regulation. Bandura's theory of self-regulation tells us that motivation and sustained effort are affected by three things: self-observation, self-evaluation, and self-reactions. Self-observation involves paying attention to our own behavior. Self-evaluation means how much attention we pay to feedback. And self-reactions are the internal processes we use in response to self-evaluation. So once we do the self-evaluation, how do we react to that, right? Are we paying attention to feedback, and then how do we react to that feedback? And self-efficacy is a person's belief that they can succeed. And not surprisingly, people with high self-efficacy have a lot of motivation. If you think you can do it, of course you'll be more motivated to try. Another application-based theory is called job characteristics theory. There's a lot of information on this slide, so I'm going to take it nice and slow on here, but we are almost done. Job characteristics theory tells us that the core job dimensions result in psychological states, which then result in personal and work outcomes. So first, let's look at the little flow chart. Under the blue side, we have core job dimensions, which involve skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback. I'll talk about what those actually mean in a minute, but all of those job dimensions lead to the critical psychological states: meaningfulness, responsibility, and knowledge of your results of what's going on. And together, those all lead to high motivation, high performance, high satisfaction, and low absenteeism and low turnover, right? Low absenteeism means you're not missing a lot of work, and low turnover means you're not constantly quitting and finding new jobs, right? So let's talk about those core job dimensions and what they mean, because obviously they're really important. They lead to the meaningfulness, responsibility, and knowledge of results, which lead to all of those positive outcomes. On the right-hand side, you can see that task significance is how strongly they perceive their job to impact others' lives. Is your job important? Are the tasks you're doing important? Are they significant to the world? Task identity, how well an employee is able to associate his or her task with the actual outcome. If you feel like the task you're doing all day is not highly related to the job outcome, it's hard to stay motivated. Skill variety, as you can guess, is the degree of different job tasks and differing abilities. So all of these things are good. We want to have them. We want task significance, task identity, and skill variety. We also want feedback, receiving direct information regarding how effective your performance is so far. Without feedback, it's hard to gauge how you're doing. And finally, autonomy, the extent to which employees have the freedom to dictate their own approach. All of these are desired things. If we have high levels of these core job dimensions, we will experience meaningfulness, responsibility, and knowledge of what we're doing, and all of that will lead to motivation, high performance, high job satisfaction, and a lack of undesirable things like absenteeism and turnover. So they actually created a formula, as you can see right at the very bottom, which says that your motivational personal score is your skill variety plus task identity plus task significance divided by 3. So those are averaged out, and that's why in the diagram they're in the same box. Then you multiply that by the autonomy and by feedback. So as you can see, autonomy and job feedback are more important than the first 3. They're weighted more and valued more. And you can actually come up with a number, a motivational score, if you use this formula. All right, second to last theory of motivation. This isn't really so much of a theory. We're talking about job redesign and how redesigning a job can improve the motivation of your employees. And when redesigning a job, you can use job rotation, where employees take turns doing different tasks. Job enrichment, where you're increasing the potential of a job by the motivational potential by increasing their authority and the control that they have over their own job. That's the autonomy stuff we talked about on the last slide. And finally, job enlargement, where you expand their duties and responsibilities. And all 3 of these things can improve employee motivation. On the right-hand side, a quick side note, it's not a theory, it's just an important definition that compensation is the total amount of both monetary and non-monetary pay provided to an employee by an employer. And interestingly, although you probably do know this, in the United States, women are paid on average only 77 cents for every dollar paid to men. In the little map down there, it shows in green the best states for women to work, and in blue the worst ones. You can see Hawaii, we're in the middle, with women making 83 cents on the dollar. All right, on to our last application-based theory of motivation. This one's a little bit long, but you might be familiar with it already. Operant conditioning is a term that was coined by Skinner, one of the most famous psychologists. And it says that learning happens when behavior is influenced by its antecedents and consequences. So what happens before and after. And in fact, it's really more about after in this case. Up in the very right-hand corner next to Bart, you can see a little graph, or a little table, which is larger in your textbook. And we're going to discuss the difference between positive and negative reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. Another word for extinction is negative punishment. I found these awesome graphics online, and they were perfect for our lesson, so I threw them in here. Let's look at our first Simpsons picture. Marge and Lisa and Bart can smell something stinky. So they take out the trash, they clean up the house, and then the stink is gone. The yucky smell is gone. This is negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is not a negative thing. It's a good thing. It's when something you don't want gets removed by the desirable behavior. Another good example of negative reinforcement is using sunscreen, right? You get sunburned, you get sunburned, you get sunburned. You start using sunscreen, no more sunburn. Maybe I'll keep using sunscreen. The unwanted stimulus, the sunburn, was removed by the behavior, using sunscreen. Or in the Simpsons case, the unwanted stimulus of stinky trash was removed by the behavior of cleaning up and taking out the rubbish. On to positive reinforcement. This is the reinforcement we may be a little bit more used to. This is rewarding the stimulus. So you're adding something. It's a rewarding stimulus, something good. For example, Bart got a good grade on his test because he studied hard. That was positive reinforcement. Another example is when you ask a dog to do a trick and then you give him a treat. That's positive reinforcement, right? Even a bonus or a pat on the back would count as positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is the best way to change behavior. Moving on to punishment, which is the worst way to change behavior, but is still used by a lot of people, we'll talk about the difference between positive and negative punishment. So positive punishment is when you add something unpleasant. You can see Bart is being made to write lines on the board for perhaps skateboarding in the hall. Negative punishment is still a punishment, but you remove something desirable. He got his skateboard taken away. In both cases, this is a punishment, but you can punish somebody by making them do something or giving them something negative, or you can punish them by taking away something positive. So that's why that chart up on the top right is quite important, because you can see when you add a stimulus, when you add a consequence, If it's a good consequence, this is considered positive reinforcement. It makes people do the behavior more. If it's a bad consequence you're adding, it's called positive punishment, and it makes people do the behavior less. However, you can also take away things. Negative reinforcement is when you take away something bad. So you're increasing their behavior by rewarding them by taking away the bad thing. And finally, there's negative punishment where we take away a good thing. And this decreases the unwanted behavior because you're taking something good away from them. Another word for negative punishment is called extinction, removing the desirable thing, removing the thing that they like. One more slide on reinforcement. We just talked about the different types of reinforcement. We talked about negative and positive reinforcement and negative and positive punishment, right? So now let's look at the reinforcement schedules. You can use all of these things on different types of schedules. On the left-hand side, we see continuous reinforcement. Happens every time. This is a real simple one, right? Every time you press the button on the remote, the channel changes. It works every time, so you learn very quickly to press the button on the remote. Skinner had rats learning to press a lever to get their food, and they would press the lever and the food would come out every single time, and they very quickly learned to press the lever when they were hungry or wanted to eat. However, on the right-hand side, we'll talk about variable reinforcement, which is when the reinforcement doesn't happen every time. And this is more realistic, usually, for a lot of things in real life, right? Skinner also studied variable reinforcement with rats, but we won't get into that today. When there's variable reinforcement, that means you don't get the reinforcement or the punishment every single time. Variable reinforcement can be fixed or variable, and then it can be fixed interval, fixed ratio, or variable interval, variable ratio. What fixed means is it's scheduled. It's going to always happen after the same amount of time or the same amount of behaviors. So intervals refer to time. A fixed interval schedule, an example of this would be a child who behaves, gets weekly allowance. They get their allowance every Friday as a reward for behaving. This is on a fixed interval. It doesn't happen every single time they behave, right? Every time they do a chore, they don't get paid. They just get paid on Friday, once a week, for behaving. That's a set time schedule. A fixed ratio is a set schedule, but it's not a time, it's a number of behaviors. So for example, when you buy 10 coffees, you get one free. If we were talking about the chores, that same child, instead of getting their allowance every Friday, might get their allowance every 6 chores. Moving on to the variable reinforcement, this is random, more like a slot machine. So variable intervals, an example could be a friend who stops by to visit once in a while. You're a good friend, and this is reinforced by them stopping by to visit or bring you a pie or a treat, but only every few weeks. Sometimes it's every week, sometimes they'll go 2 weeks, sometimes they'll come twice in a week. The interval varies. It's not the same every time, but it's still a time interval. And finally, we have the variable ratio schedule, where the number of behaviors varies. This is the good example for this is a slot machine, right? Sometimes you'll pull the crank on the slot machine and twice in a row it'll pay out, and sometimes it won't pay out until you do it 20 times, and then it's another 10 times, and then another 500. It's a variable ratio, but it doesn't pay out every certain number of minutes or hours. It pays out according to how many pulls on the machine or presses of the button. There's lots of examples online of this stuff as well. Let me know if you need any more information on the reinforcement schedules. I personally find this stuff very interesting. All right, it is review time. Let's see how fast we can get through our Chapter 9 review. Work motivation is a set of energetic forces that originate both within as well as beyond the individual to initiate work-related behavior and to determine its form, direction, intensity, and duration. Intrinsic motivation comes from within the individual. They engage in the behavior because it's personally rewarding. Extrinsic motivation originates from outside the individual. We're motivated by money or by promotion at work. Performance is affected by motivation, ability, and environment. Today we're talking about motivation. Now we'll discuss some needs-based theories of motivation. There's Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory, that our actions are motivated by our quest to fulfill our 5 basic human needs, starting with our basic survival, moving all the way up to self-actualization. ERG theory is another needs-based theory put forth by Alderfer in 1969. And this theory says that individuals have 3 core needs: existence, relatedness, and growth. Basically grouped Maslow's needs together. The 2-factor theory is the one about the motivators and the hygiene factors. So remember, motivators make you satisfied with your job, and hygiene factors, only when they're bad, make you dissatisfied with your job. But them being good doesn't satisfy you. Acquired needs theory, that's my favorite one, states that human motivation is determined by the needs of that person, and that each person has a different constellation of these 3 needs: achievement, power, and affiliation. Need for achievement, wanting to excel and succeed. Need for power, wanting to influence others and make an impact. And need for affiliation, wanting to have friendships and feel accepted. Everybody has all 3 of these, but the dominant one really governs your motivation. And in order to figure out which one of those needs is dominant, you can take the thematic apperception test, which is a picture that an expert shows you, and when you tell a story for that picture, they're able to assess your dominant need. Equity theory tells us that equity theory is the comparison that individuals make to determine if what they're receiving is fair compared to what they're giving. Remember, they're also comparing themselves to others. Inputs are the things that the person brings to the situation: their education, their experience, their effort, their abilities, their knowledge. The outcomes are what they get from the organization: pay, promotions, recognition, pat on the back, free lunch. Equity sensitives are people who really want this equity to be fair. They want the input and outcome to be balanced, and they want the ratios to be the same for everybody. Entitled's prefer getting more than they give, and they want to have a better ratio than their peers. Benevolents are okay with getting less than they give and having a lower ratio than their peers. Justice tells us how fair an employee believes the employer is to its employees. I'm sorry, I realized I forgot to tell you we moved on to the process-based theories, but that's okay. So justice is how fair something is, right? In this case, we're talking about in the workplace. Procedural justice are perceptions of the fairness of policies and rules and guidelines. Interpersonal justice is the perception of fairness of how fairly you're being treated by others, by your coworkers, your superiors, everybody in the organization. And distributive justice is the perceptions of fairness regarding the actual outcomes. So this is the one that's similar to equity. We're looking at, is the outcome fair for how much I put into this? Expectancy theory is a theory that tells us that we expect for our effort to result in performance, and then we expect that performance turns into rewards, and hopefully those rewards have high valence for us, that they're worth a lot for us. So remember, expectancy theory means that you expect that if you put in a lot of effort, you will perform well, and that if you perform well, you will be rewarded well. Goal commitment is the determination of an individual to reach his or her goal. Obviously, high goal commitment results in high motivation. Interestingly, researchers have also found that the harder the goal is, the more motivation the person will have. Talking about Bandura's self-reflection, we have self-observation, how much attention we pay to our own behavior, self-evaluation, paying attention to the feedback, and self-reactions, how we process that feedback. Moving on to the core job tasks that can affect motivation, we have task significance, which is how strongly they think their job impacts others' lives. Task identity, the association between the task the employee is doing and the actual job outcome. Skill variety, different abilities and tasks required on the job. Feedback, getting direct information regarding how effective your performance has been. And autonomy, how much freedom or basically autonomy, how much you're allowed to do things on your own, your freedom to dictate your own approach. And all of these things, task significance and identity, skill variety, feedback and autonomy, are all the core job components that lead to motivation. Compensation is the total amount of both monetary and non-monetary pay provided to an employee by an employer. And remember, a big issue with compensation is the gender wage gap. Operant conditioning is that theory by Skinner that behavior is influenced by its consequences. Remember, rewards and punishments. Positive reinforcement, giving a reward for the desired behavior. Negative reinforcement is when the desired behavior results in the removal of something unpleasant. So remember, negative reinforcement is still a good thing. It means that the person took away something you didn't like, sort of as a reward for your behavior. And finally, punishment, adding an undesirable effect for undesired behavior. Punishment does not usually work very well, and if you're going to use punishment, there are important guidelines in the textbook to read about, such as making sure that the punishments are fair to everybody. I didn't put in the review sheet about the reinforcement schedule, but it is important to understand the difference between continuous reinforcement, which means you get reinforced every time you do the behavior, and variable reinforcement, which means you only get reinforced sometimes. Variable reinforcement can be on a set interval, a set ratio, a variable interval, or a variable ratio. Remember, intervals are time and ratios are behaviors. I hope that all makes sense. I hope you enjoyed this chapter as much as I did. Please let me know if you have any questions at all. And now that you're finished with chapter 9, you are ready for exam 2, which will cover chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Please review them all before starting the exam.